The search for extraterrestrial intelligence represents humanity's quest to find signs of life beyond Earth.
Whales live in the ocean. Does that mean they are extraterrestrial?
If you're curious about SETI or ever wondered what a whale might have in common with an alien, you've come to the right place. Welcome to Whales and Aliens, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence in the Salish Sea. I'm your host, Lisa Walker. The Salish Sea is a vibrant inland waterway nestled between British Columbia and Washington State. Among its most iconic inhabitants are three distinct ecotypes of killer whale, each with its own culture, behaviors, and diet. The southern and northern resident killer whales eat fish, while the bigs or transient killer whales hunt marine mammals, while the offshore orcas are specialized shark eaters. Each ecotype offers a unique lens into orca intelligence, adaptation, and survival. Today, I am honored to welcome Jared Towers to the podcast. Jared is a marine mammal researcher whose life has been profoundly shaped by killer whales. He is the director of Bay Cetology, a nonprofit organization devoted to the study and conservation of cetaceans. His work bridges field biology with cutting-edge technology, all rooted in scientific rigor and deep cultural respect.
I grew up in Courtenay on Vancouver Island in the Comox Valley, but I spent all my summers up off the north end of Vancouver Island because my parents at the time owned a whale watching company from about 1986 up until, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago or so. And it was one of the first whale watching companies in the country. And so as a kid, I spent all my time on the water with killer whales. And it was 1987 that Dr. Mike Bigg and his colleagues published their first killer whale photo identification catalog. And that was an important part of the tours. Because we could see in the book which whales we were looking at on a daily basis. There's many different pods and individuals coming and going. And over time, in the course of a summer, the course of several summers, the course of several decades, we got to know these individual whales. As a kid, I was surrounded by the children of other researchers and other whale watch company owners, and as time went on, it was just a continual exposure to not only people who came so far from many different places around the world to see killer whales, just to take photos or fulfill a childhood dream or whatever the case may be, but also to conduct research, whether it was long-term or just over the course of a summer. And so being in the epicenter of that, that really was what I thought life was all about. And so I naturally just kept on doing it. This was around the time that digital photography was coming on scene, and there was a lot more data coming in and a bit of an uncertainty on how to adopt the technology. And so that became my role, was really making that transition. And basically the rest is history. I've been surrounded by, killer whales and living on the coast my whole life. So this is, and being on boats. So this is pretty much just what I've always done. FinWave makes use of artificial intelligence or deep learning models, which we've built, which help expedite the process of ID. For proof of concept, we've designed this thing and we've tested it, and it functions at over 90%, which is pretty good. Most of the time it's right. The advantage of this and integrating it into this platform, which we called FinWave, which anybody can go to at finwave.io, is that we have a lot of things automated on that platform. So it's very easy to just submit the data. The model instantly predicts who the individuals are. We go through and confirm or correct the predictions. It's basically a one-stop shop for your data submissions, your data analysis, and your catalog curation. It really automates, expedites, and streamlines the entire process of photo ID right down to exporting whatever kind of data you want. Birth years of every whale, boom, export it. All encounters from this period to that period, exported, or that location to that location. All the co-occurrence data, which whales are traveling with which ones. And so it's basically a foundation for all the different kinds of analyses you could ever want to do in the population, from looking at trends in abundance, distribution, behaviors, you name it. It's all there. So I think it's really, if we want to start using AI to help us deal with big data, this is the application for photo ID studies and photo ID population managers. So it's an exciting time for that, building the technology and then actually testing it, and we can see that it's working well. So it's good stuff. I'll just keep this focused on big killer whales because we're here in the Pacific Northwest, and that is really the predominant ecotype or subspecies of killer whale that we all see and know, and they're also probably the most interesting. I mean, I think they are anyways. I might be biased, but I spend a lot of time working with northern residents, and I love them dearly. But there's a lot more variance in the behavior of big killer whales, and we've seen some interesting things over the years. I think that a couple of more recent projects that I've worked on has been one using high quality photo ID data for very common individuals, those individuals that are seen many times a year, to look at how scarring rates differ between different sex and age classes. And we felt that there was some secrets in there. And we were right. We found that for females, especially as they get older, it's very, very uncommon for them to get raked by other killer whales, which kind of falls in line with this idea that the female is the boss. They're the most dominant sex of killer whales. They lead the pods, and as they get older, they get more dominant. Nobody messes with the elderly females, especially after they're post-reproductive. And the scarring data indicate that nobody is touching them. On the other hand, adult males continue to get raked up quite a bit throughout their life. And that falls in line with an idea that there may be some sexual competition going on, perhaps between males, or maybe it's adult females that rake the adult males up when they're trying to mate with them or something. We don't know what the source of the rakes is, but we do know who the recipients are. And one of the other things we found is that the younger the individual, the more likely it is to have rakes, which indicates that especially calves, they have very high rake to body surface ratios. And this is an indicator of infant-directed aggression. And it's also as they age a bit, when they're 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, those rake rates tend to slow down a little bit, but they remain pretty high for males compared to females. They kind of start to diverge a little bit around the mid-juvenile ages. But that may be a sign that those whales are also playing more with each other using their teeth. And because rakes can be a sign of aggression, but they can also be caused by play. It's just that the ones that we're more likely to see are the ones that are deeper, the ones that are caused by aggression or aggressive acts. And we don't have to look at aggression as a negative thing. It is just the way that these whales live their lives, in the sense that they don't have hands or fingers, and a lot of the way that they express themselves is through their teeth. They're not trying to kill each other in many cases. They're just trying to get their point across. And so it tells us a little bit about the way they live their lives, the behaviors that they are exposed to, and the behaviors that they also conduct, depending on their age and their sex. And one interesting thing we found was that these variances in scarring rates between different sex and age classes were very, very similar, no matter which population of killer whale you were looking at. So even northern residents, which are very different from big killer whales, had very similar scarring rates, indicating that socio-sexual behaviors or mating strategies or just basically the way these animals live their lives socially has not diverged as strongly as their prey preferences, for example, have. We know that northern residents and southern residents, they only eat fish. Transients or big killer whales only eat marine mammals. We also tested another population from the southern hemisphere, which has a very broad diet, including fish and mammals. And they all had very similar scarring rates among sex and age classes, even though they're very, very different. They occupy different niches in their ecosystems. So that was a surprising finding for that study, all reliant on photo ID data. I think they're learning for many years and maybe continually. I mean, who was it the other day that I saw? I saw T36 with T36B and T36B1 and T36B1A, and this was like a group of 4 generations traveling together. And there's a couple groups like that now in the big killer whales, where you have these multi-generational cohesive units. And I'm sure T36B is still learning from T36, even though she's a grandmother herself. But it is interesting to see, that learning is much more obvious in the juveniles. For like a certain prey item, like a Dall's porpoise or a Pacific white-sided dolphin, which move very quickly, you often see the adult females chasing those prey, and then they'll maim them. And then they'll just sit back and wait for the kids to move in. But the first contact is often by the adult female, and then after that the kids catch up and finish it off, or just exhaust it by chasing it for 10 or 15 minutes until it just can't swim along anymore. Yeah, so sometimes it takes them a minute to join in for those maybe the more risky parts of the hunt, depending on their age, of course. Big killer whales, they're very adaptive in that sense. I think more so than residents. They're more open to learning, perhaps more plastic by nature, because even though they specialize in hunting mammals for the most part, they've developed different ways of hunting different mammals. And that's not to say that resident killer whales haven't developed different ways to hunt different species of fish, but they make a living by doing something relatively narrow by comparison, I think. And so they don't seem to be as interested in exploratory behaviors or exploiting new opportunities. I mean, I occasionally see, well, actually quite often, you see big killer whales doing new things. And it's just like, what are you doing in there? I watched the T49Bs and T49A1 swim up the river across from where I live and where I'm sitting right now a couple years ago. And I don't think they'd ever been up there before. It was just high tide and they decided to go up the river. And I'm like, this is extremely dangerous. And here you are just doing it because you can and because you're curious and interested. It's not something I think we would normally see resident killer whales doing, because they're always trying to exploit that niche that they know best, which is find salmon, get better at finding salmon, or other similar sized fish. Whereas these big killer whales, I mean, they do make a living hunting close to shore, so the river seemed like an okay choice. But oftentimes being close to shore means you're in very shallow water, and with the tide cycles, you do get strandings sometimes. And that's one thing that I published a paper on a few years ago, is that there's these live stranding events of killer whales along the coast here, and every single one of them is of big killer whales. Resident killer whales, we don't have any single records of them live stranding for decades now, but all the records we do have from Alaska right down to Washington, are of big killer whales, and they seem to be associated with hunting harbor seals. And in almost every case, they have waited out a tide cycle until the tide came back in, and then they either got pushed off the rocks or they swam away when there was enough water. But they were high and dry for hours in each one of these cases. Yeah, well, that is one of the outliers, and there are seals in there, and it is shallow water and a dangerous spot. But whether T109A3 and Brave Little Hunter, her daughter, went in there for hunting reasons, or whether the mother got kind of washed in there on the tide, in the incoming tide, we don't really know. One of the issues was that when she was found, she was stranded on her side, which is the kind of way that you don't want to strand if you're a whale. And there may have been something going on with her internally. Like, she was pregnant at the time. She wasn't a long ways pregnant, but maybe there was something going on which caused her, health-wise, to strand, and not be able to, have full control over her body. And she was still alive, of course, but when the tide came in, she drowned. Yeah, the other option is, of course, that they just went in there under their own free will to chase harbor seals, and she ended up sideways on the riverbank. And it looks like she did throw up in there, because there was a piece of seal. The first people that found her found some seal remains on the beach that eventually washed away as the tide came in. But that does happen with killer whales. I can think of a case in Alaska and a case in the Falklands where male killer whales who stranded threw up, probably just because there's a lot of pressure, that's the force of gravity. And I think both of those killer whales ended up dying, just like T109A3. But in any case, that's a very long story as far as the response goes to her daughter, who, while I was watching, swam into the lagoon. She had two options. She could have swam out the way that she came in, which was a very narrow entrance under a bridge associated with a lot of tidal activity, or she could have swam through some very shallow water into a very big and deep lagoon. And she swam right through the shallows, rated high slack. At slack tide, things become a little bit less scary for any whale. And instead of going left, she went right. And as soon as she did that, I thought, oh, we have a problem on our hands here. As if, the fact that her mom died wasn't enough. Now we have an orphan who's stuck in a place where she's not going to have any access to other killer whales. And it took us 6 weeks, and we tried many things, and we finally got her out. But all the traditional tools that we used, and I've worked with killer whales in these situations before, primarily using playbacks, which I know you've been interested in and involved in as well, up in Alaska. I'd love to hear more about that. And used those, had great success with those, to entice killer whales out of similar situations in Alaska and in Comox Harbor. But it didn't work as well for Brave Little Hunter. And in the end, it stopped working altogether. We got the opposite reaction we had hoped for at first, and then she became desensitized to it very quickly. So yeah, so over time, my friends and colleagues at Nuchatlit First Nation, Rob John in particular, wanted to start feeding her, and I said, yes, I think you should. It's our last resort. I mean, at the risk of habituation, which is a serious concern for a young killer whale, but it worked. And it didn't work the first time, and it didn't seem to work very well the second time. But the third time, I watched her eat everything that he tossed to her. And from that point forward, as soon as he got on the water, she came right over. And so we used that to get her out. It's amazing to elicit a response from a wild whale. And um, because a lot of the time, especially in this part of the world, you're on a boat or, you're right in their environment and they completely ignore you. Um, or they're trying to get away from you. In my experience, I'm driving up to them and sometimes they'll deviate a little bit or slow down or speed up, because they don't want me to be as close as I should be for collecting the samples or whatever I need to do. But or even when you're viewing, from a distance. I mean, if you're in the way, sure, they'll swim right past you, but they're not necessarily coming over because they want to interact. They're just, you're just in the way. I mean, it does happen sometimes that, people get, mugged, as a lot of people refer to it as, by a humpback whale, or you get a killer whale come over and swim over and, look up at the people on board or something. But to actually, instigate that response by doing something like a playback is very powerful and very novel and almost scary, because it's like, this is what works and we don't even know what we're doing, like it's I think it's probably quite interesting for the whales in some cases, but and it's helped, to get them out of dangerous situations sometimes, but it's totally experimental. Like, we could have had the opposite response and made the situation worse, but in the end, whether it was choosing the right vocals or the right way to do the playback, not too many of them, not too few, and keep them guessing, and because you're really working with the mind of an intelligent creature when you're doing these playback studies, because you're playing a hoax on a very clever animal, and it's not easy to play a hoax on a clever animal. It's never the point of the research to go out and, and publish a paper like this, but it's just that over time, as I learned more about killer whales and all the things that I was learning about people by studying killer whales, like I've learned more about our evolution by dedicating my career to understanding killer whales than I would have probably in any other field other than if I was an anthropologist. But so much of how they've evolved and how they behave and who they are is very relatable to us as a species. And especially the more we learn about them. And so with that, in the back of my mind, I started thinking about, why are they trying to offer us food? Like, what's the purpose of this? And I mean, what happened first was that I got offered food by a killer whale. And it was astonishing. I mean, the second time it happened 3 years later, my colleague who was on board at the time, Salish Sea, she summarized it best when we were all just watching. There was four of us on board, my other three colleagues and myself, and T-46C2 just swam up to the boat. It was a perfectly calm day. We had stopped the vessel because we saw her, and we were just kind of waiting to figure out where she was going and how best to approach her for photo ID. We just stopped. She came right over to us, and she had a harbor seal in her mouth, which was freshly dead. She hadn't ripped it apart. She had obviously just grabbed it, and she just dropped it right in front of us, like not even 6 feet from where we were standing. And like it was flat calm and the water was quite clear enough that and close enough that I got out my iPhone and I turned the camera on and took some pictures of this harbor seal just sitting there just under the surface. And I continued to take a few more photos as she had swam a circle around the boat over a course of about 15 or 20 seconds, and then came back and picked the seal up right in front of us, almost like, okay, if you're not going to take that, I'll take it. And then she went over and started ripping it apart and eating it. But before that happened, Tasley said, she kind of stopped and looked at us and she's like, did that just happen? And it was one of those almost cosmic experiences where I think we were all thinking the same thing, like, what is going on here? Why did this lone killer whale just give us a harbor seal? And and then when we decided not to take it, she went and ate it herself. I can't think of any other predator on the planet, especially terrestrial predators, that would go out and, go through the effort of killing something and then just offer it to people. When was the last time a lion went and killed a buffalo and then just, brought it over to some people and said, oh, here you go. I mean, many people think about cats, when they read or hear about this study. It's like, oh yeah, my cat does that. It's like, yeah, your cat does that because you have a relationship with it. You are that cat's owner. It relies on you. And so there's a sense of reciprocity there, or a form of reciprocity that already exists. But in these cases, these are wild animals that are almost looking to instigate reciprocity with us in the same way that we might with a wild animal. We're famous for feeding birds and trying to tame wild animals and then domesticate them through experimentation and exploration. And then we benefit from those things. We benefit from our environment because we're smart enough to manipulate it. And I don't think killer whales are any different. And I think they've been manipulating other species in their environment to their own benefit forever. And whether that's Machiavellian or not, sometimes it could be, and sometimes it doesn't have to be. It could be a symbiotic relationship, or it could be very one-sided. And there's already examples of both those things with killer whales and people, from them stealing fish off fishing boats, fishing lines, to them helping traditional whalers catch whales and then sharing in the spoils. So there's already examples of cooperative behaviors between people and killer whales in the literature and in our histories. Um, yeah, it's a remarkable topic, and I kind of went down a rabbit hole of comparative psychology to try and explain why it was novel and what we can take home from it. Interesting topic, this concept of communication and how that actually relates to like search for extraterrestrial life or intelligence. And what really is communication in the first place. And if it's just an exchange of information, then it's very broadly applicable, and we're already communicating with many different other species. But and I think many other species are attempting to communicate with us as well, and including killer whales. I mean, there's convergent evolution, definitely. If you go back far enough, I'm sure there's a common ancestor, but it's been a long time. And, we didn't have to each develop these, extremely large brains compared to the rest of our body mass. And, we didn't have to develop these long lifespans or these, very cohesive, socially knit societies, and the ability to communicate with meaning often as a way to, go through your life and make sense of the world. We didn't both, evolve these post-reproductive lifespans in females because we're mammals. The killer whales and humans did all that because we're on a convergent evolutionary path. And I think that where that's going, I have no idea, but it certainly looks like, there's something to be said for being the apex predator of your biome. Killer whales are the apex predator of the marine world, and we are undoubtedly the apex predator of the terrestrial world. And we share all these traits. This is what dominance looks like. This is what planetary dominance looks like. It looks like what, killer whales and people share in common. And yeah, and that may be just down to like cooperative hunting in order to take down prey that is larger than yourself. There's not a lot of species on the planet that do that. And with that, comes all this food sharing behavior, which can be used to practice all kinds of different reciprocity with your environment, from, that which involves kin to that which doesn't. And then you use these large brains to keep track of all these relationships that you have with kin, other species, the environment, and everything. And yeah, I was going to ask you, because whales live in the ocean, does that mean they are extraterrestrial? I look back over the last 20, and I see that several of the questions that I've had, I've managed to answer, and they're basic questions though. It's just like, how many minke whales live here, and what are they feeding on? It's like, okay, I've got those answers now. Do minke whales vocalize? And if so, what does it sound like? I've got that answer. And and that is, a very northern Vancouver Island, based study that I've been working on for 20 years. And it's not very high profile because nobody cares about minke whales except me, you know. Um, but I love asking those questions and then going out and finding the answers. And I think on a bigger scale, that's what we do with killer whales. And while I love it, I see that, the basic answers, or the basic questions, have already been answered. And we're getting into some pretty nitty-gritty stuff now when it comes to learning more about killer whales. And that's kind of why I wanted to steer in a new direction with that paper about the interspecific offerings. So killer whales offering people food, because I surround myself with a lot of people working in biology, other cetologists, and there's a lot of wonderful work, coming out from my colleagues, and I have a lot of respect for many of them, most of them, in fact. But the discipline of biology is taught with a fairly rigid framework, and it doesn't allow for a lot of anthropomorphization, or even when you're talking about psychology, it's kind of a soft science by comparison. But I really believe that we can't really understand these animals, or our place on this planet, properly without taking the psychology of things like killer whales into account. And we have a very dominant approach to everything we do on this planet, as if we own it. I hear people in the news, or even in conferences or conversations, talk about our southern residents and our humpbacks, but I don't have a lot of problem with that, but I think it's incorrect. I think that these species and these cultures, these populations, whatever they are, they're their own nations, and I think we need to treat them with the same respect that we treat other groups of peoples. I think in 10 years, I'd like to see some headway within the fields made towards understanding who these animals are, and and how we can coexist better with them, and not from a management framework, but through an intellectual and action-based framework, where it's not coming from the top down, it's coming from the bottom up. It's more of a, I'm going to do this because I have respect for those animals and I don't want to interfere with whatever they're doing, kind of approach. And if I can answer some questions along the way about, what's going on in some of the more remote waters of British Columbia, I'd be quite happy.